E2 E4. Knight G8 F6. Knight B1 C3. D7 D5. E4 E5. Knight F6 D7. F2 F4. C7 C5. Knight C3 takes on D5. Knight C3 captures D5. Knight D7 captures E5. Knight D5 E3. Knight E5 C6. E2 E4. Knight G8 F6. Knight B1 C3. D7 D5. E4 E5. Knight F6 E4. Knight C3 E2. D5 D4. C2 C3. Knight B8 C6. C3 takes on D4. C3 captures D4. Knight E4 G5. F2 F4. This advance meets the demands of the situation. It is White's main line and a recommendation of this author. Dieser Vorstoß entspricht den Anforderungen der Stellung, stellt die Weishauptvariante in diesem Abspiel dar. Ihn empfehlen des Autors. Knight G5 E6.
Baik naman girl. Ay lang. Ganun ako. Ha? Ganun ako. Ha? Ah! Ikaw nang loob. Oh, panggot sa sinalalanan. Momente momente.
Knight E6 captures D4. Knight E2 takes on D4. Knight C6 takes on D4. Queen D1 A4. Knight D4 C6. Bishop F1 B5. Bishop C8 D7. E5 E6. Bishop D7 captures E6. Knight F3 E5. Bishop e6 d7. Knight e5 takes on c6. b7 captures c6. Bishop b5 captures c6. e7 e6. b2 b3. Yen b2 superscript 2. Bishop f8 e7. Bishop c1 b2. Bishop e7 f6. Bishop b2 captures f6. g7 captures f6. Rook a1 c1. 1-0 Kosteniuk A Popov L/Wijkon Z 1999/41. e2 e4. Knight g8 f6. Knight b1 c3. d7 d5. e4 e5. Knight f6 e4.
Bitches!
Knight c3 e2. d5 d4. c2 c3. Knight b8 c6. Knight e2 takes on d4. Knight e2 captures d4. Knight c6 captures d4. Queen d1 a4. c7 c6. This shall secure the square d5 and block the pawn d4, it will soon be there. Die soll das Feld d5 sichern und den auf d4 auf Tachenden Bauern festigen. Queen a4 captures d4. Queen d8 takes on d4. c3 captures d4. Knight e4 g5. e6. Bishop f1 c4. Bishop c8 f5. d2 d3. Knight g5 e6. Bishop c1 e3. Knight e6 c7. Rook a1 c1. Aimed against b5. Dies ist gegen b5 gerichtet.
100 days Minecraft din that mode ko. Why ikaw ka? Anong YouTube yan?
g7 g6. Knight g1 e2. Bishop f8 g7. Knight e2 g3. Bishop f5 e6.
Duo dapat, duo.
Knight g3 e4.
Best duo na.
Bishop e6 d5. Castling king side. Castling queen side. b2 b4. 1-0 Zeidler S. Buckley D/England 2000/54. e2 e4. Knight g8 f6. Knight b1 c3. d7 d5. e4 e5. Knight f6 e4. Knight c3 e2. f7 f6. d2 d3. Knight e4 g5. Bishop c1 captures g5. f6 captures g5. h2 h4. h2 h4. g5 g4. Knight e2 f4. g7 g6. d3 d4. Bishop f8 h6. Knight g1 e2. Bishop c8 f5. h4 h5. c7 c6. h5 captures g6. h7 captures g6. Queen d1 d2. Queen d8 b6. Castling queenside.
Mabukas ako dodo magating ma. Wow, mana ka pagkaon.
e2 e4. Knight g8 f6. Knight b1 c3. d7 d5. e4 e5. d5 d4. e5 captures f6. d4 takes on c3. f6 takes on g7. c3 captures d2. Bishop c1 takes on d2. Bishop f8 takes on g7. Queen d1 f3. Queen d1 f3. The Balashov variation. Die Balashov variante. Bishop g7 captures b2. Rook a1 d1. The critical position. Die kritiske stellung. Queen d8 d4. Is most often played. Word Haufigsten gespielt. Knight g1 e2. Queen d4 g4. Queen f3 b3. Bishop b2 g7. Knight e2 f4. Bishop g7 e5. g2 g3. Yen h3. Queen g4 g7. Bishop f1 g2. Knight b8 d7. Knight f4 d3. Bishop captures b7. Rook b8. Bishop e5 d4. Castling king side. Knight d7 b6. c2 c3. Bishop d4 f6. Knight d3 c5. c7 c6. a2 a4. a2 a4. e2 e4. Knight g8 f6. Knight b1 c3. d7 d5. e4 e5. Knight f6 d7. Knight c3 captures d5. Knight d7 captures e5. Knight d5 e3. c7 c5. b2 b3. b2 b3.
I'll take a scar. I'll take a scar on the back of it. No, okay. He said he didn't have that many brothers. Okay. Yeah, I'll shoot him. I'll shoot him as fast as we can. Yeah, I'll look for a way out. We can jump into the river. Get over here. Yeah, I'm gonna jump. Ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Shit! Oh my god, I almost missed! Almost missed! I so hot one. Suddenly realizing there were no survivors left in this village. Welcome to Dominic's Minecraft. Okay, you can do every boss and get every pet in the game. I'm gonna find Bernardino. There are so many stuff in here that like I was just like, get that monkey in here. Oh, that's kind of low. Oh, what? Oh my god. What is that? I got him. Whoa, it's bonded. Oh. We died! We died!
g7 g6. Bishop c1 b2. f2 f4. Bishop c1 b2. Bishop f8 g7. Knight e3 c4. Knight e3 c4. f2 f4. Knight d3. Bishop captures d3. Bishop takes on b2. Bishop f8 g7. Knight e3 c4. Knight b8 c6. f2 f4. Knight e5 captures c4. Bishop b2 captures g7. Rook h8 g8. Bishop g7 c3. Knight c4 d6. Knight g1 f3. Queen d8 c7. Knight f3 e5. Bishop c8 f5. g2 g4. Bishop f5 e4. Rook h1 g1.
Oh no. No. I know exactly where this is going, and I don't like it. I'm scared. Richard, do you want to do it? No? Okay, alright. It's gotta be me. Okay, so let's break this block right here. Push the water down like this. And you're going nothing. Oh, this is so sketchy.
Knight e5 g6. Bishop c1 b2. e7 e5. h2 h4. Knight b8 c6. Bishop f1 b5. Bishop c8 d7. h4 h5. Knight g6 f4. h5 h6. Knight c6 d4. h6 captures g7. Bishop f8 captures g7. Bishop b5 captures d7. Queen d8 captures d7. g2 g3. Knight f4 g6. Queen d1 h5. Castling queenside. Castling queenside. Ginsburg G. Bajerov v. Berliner Sommer 1994/1-0, 60. Knight e5 c6. Bishop c1 b2. e7 e5. Bishop f1 c4. Bishop f8 d6. Queen d1 h5. g7 g6. Queen h5 f3. Castling king side. Knight g1 e2. Knight c6 d4. Queen f3 e4. e7 e6. Bishop c1 b2. Knight b8 c6. 6. bc6. Knight b8 c6. Bishop c1 b2. e7 e6. f2 f4. Knight e5 d7. Knight g1 f3. Bishop f8 d6. Bishop b2 captures g7. Rook h8 g8. Bishop g7 h6. Rook g8 g6. Bishop h6 g5. f7 f6. f4 f5. Rook g6 captures g5. Knight f3 captures g5. f6 captures g5. Queen d1 h5. King e8 f8. Bishop f1 c4. Knight d7 f6. Queen h5 h6. King f8 e8. f5 takes on e6. e2 e4. Knight g8 f6. Knight b1 c3. d7 d5. e4 e5. d5 d4. Knight c3 e2. Knight f6 g4. f2 f4. h7 h5. Knight g1 f3.
Today was the last video ever in the Dream FNP month. The past 2 years of my life came to an end. No more contest between what
c7 c5.
today. This is the final.
Knight e2 g3.
I had a few last things I needed to do. And let me tell you, wow, you're gonna love it. I really hope you do enjoy. Welcome back to the Dream SMP. Oh no. A bit of a list I'd like to do.
Knight e2 g3. g7 g6. Bishop f1 d3. Knight b8 c6. h2 h3. Knight g4 h6. a2 a3. e7 e6. b2 b3. Bishop f8 e7. Castling king side. Knight h6 f5. Knight g3 e4. b7 b6. Bishop c1 b2. Bishop c8 b7. Queen d1 e2. Queen d8 d7. Knight f3 g5. a7 a6. Rook a1 b1. Awaiting move. Ein Abwartezug. h5 h4. Rook b1 d1. e2 e4. Knight g8 f6. Knight b1 c3. d7 d5. e4 e5. Knight f6 e4. Knight c3 e2. d5 d4. c2 c3. Knight b8 c6. c3 takes on d4. Knight e4 g5. f2 f4. Knight g5 e6. Knight g1 f3. Knight e6 captures d4. Knight e2 takes on d4. Knight c6 captures d4. Queen d1 a4. Knight d4 c6. Bishop f1 b5. Bishop c8 d7. e5 e6. Bishop d7 captures e6. Knight f3 e5. Bishop e6 d7. Knight e5 captures c6. b7 captures c6. Bishop b5 takes on c6. e7 e6. b2 b3. Yen b2 superscript 2. Bishop f8 e7. Bishop c1 b2. Bishop e7 f6. Bishop b2 captures f6. g7 captures f6. Rook a1 c1.